response to the act of America taking out this general. And, this is a figure who other earlier presidents, both Obama and Bush, knew about. He was harder to track down. He only became more of a prominent, more visible figure in the last couple of years. But he was always there as this guy who was the spy master in control of various proxies, who was a threat to the West, a clear and present danger, who is, as Boris Johnson, I think, correctly said, people aren't going to lament his death in and of itself. But they chose not to extrajudicially assassinate him. Donald Trump decided to do it, and what we're asked to believe by people who are pro-Trump is that this is part of a strategic position he's taken in regard to Iran. The world is safer now, is what some of the people in the administration have said. But of course, it appears to everybody else in the world that this is a person who acts on emotion, this is a person who conducts Twitter diplomacy, who makes decisions quickly, who makes decisions based on whims, who doesn't have an end game, even less so than his predecessors. So he comes out of the Iran deal not because he has a plan for what he wishes to see in Iran, it's because he wants to lay down a marker against what Obama does. He takes out this general, Soleimani, not necessarily because he has a concept of what will therefore happen. He just feels it's the right thing to do based on instinct, is what I read today, that phrase, instinct. This is a guy who I don't think his instinct we trust very much. So the world collectively then has to come and try and respond to it.
I mean, there's two sides to this. Obviously, it's important to remember the context of this, because while Trump has done something that I think is, really greatly endangered, or at least heightened certainly tensions in an already completely unstable area, like Stig says, it's very hard to know where we're going to go forward with this. I mean, hawkish intervention into the Middle East is a kind of an American staple at this point. It's something that has been happening for a very long time. It's something that, it wasn't so long ago that people were cheering on Trump when he engaged in airstrikes. I mean, there's precedence for this, and are we just upset because he's seemingly done this in a bit of an unthinking way? Or actually, is there a much larger question about US involvement in Iran, in Iraq, in the Middle East in more general, and who is to blame for this mess that's happening at the moment? I mean, the interesting thing about a figure like Soleimani is that he's certainly not loved by the West, but he's not even in his own country.
Well, you say that, but look at the scenes there at Tehran today. This is, for many of these people, this is genuine.
We also have to remember the fact that he killed protesters previously when there were mass protests in Iran. I mean, he's a conflicted character.
That's the irony of this. He seems to have united the country, which had, only weeks ago, seemed divided.
And I think the message from this is what is, if there is, a place for America and the West in the Middle East. Is, in other parts of the papers, this talked about this kind of horrendous blunder of the draft letter being published and then retracted. Was it meant to be sent? Was it not meant to be signed or whatever? It seems to me obvious that America and the UK should pull out. They should have pulled out a long time ago, because if you want to look at a broader point of democratic control, of a sense of nationhood, of independence in those countries, the West has been meddling, using the Middle East like its playground for decades now. It's time for that to stop.
Well, double-page spread, another great double-page spread that the Times does so well in the Times. Trump trades threats with Iran in chilling social media battle. Again, this picture, and you mentioned the confusion over the US withdrawal letter. This was written by the US top general in Iraq to his Iraqi counterpart. It seemed to suggest that US troops were pulling out. The Pentagon denied it. The US Defense Secretary came out and said absolutely not. They've had to clarify that they're not pulling out.
Well, in fact, it read as a very churlish thing. It read like it had been dictated by Trump saying, well, if you want us out, because of course Iraq passed a resolution earlier this week saying, we do want you out. And the letter seemed to say, well, if you want us out,
in deference to Iraq's parliament.
Yeah, we're leaving. And actually, the last sentence says something like, we respect your right to order us out, which felt like a sort of sulky way of ending a letter like this. And then they've now said it doesn't really hold water, and it wasn't ever meant to be said. But that headline at the top,
yes,
really, the new normal of how we live is the fact that this is a chilling social media battle. We're talking effectively about nationhood, as you say, statehood. We're talking about war and peace, and actually we're talking about it in the context of social media. And I think the big mistake with Trump is to consider him in terms of hawkishness or dovishness, to consider him in terms of what's his Middle East strategy. There isn't one. He's talking about prestige. He's talking about a sort of macho locker room sense. And that's what I think may well play well in an election year. Not that people think, and I'm sure his base that we always talk about, they don't want to see boots on the ground.
And following through on his policy promises, one of which, of course, is to get US troops out of the Middle East.
He doesn't want to have boots on. I totally accept that. I don't think you can make the case that he is a secret hawk who wants to expand military presence. But what he will do is he wants to be seen as the maverick. He wants to be seen as the person who uses disproportionate, to quote him, force. If you kick him in the shins, he will punch you in the face. That sort of macho posturing is his version of hawk.
I agree with most of that, but the thing that I'd say that, they have got this strategy of so-called maximum pressure, the kind of with the sanctions and just essentially ramping it up to get Iran to back down. But you have to see that this is in the broader context of recent American history. This kind of action in the Middle East is not wildly out of step with what's happened previously. I mean, it's in this weird circumstance in which it seems to have happened as a response to the tweet of "you can't do anything" that was kind of needling at Trump.
Well, all the pictures of the protests against the US embassy in Baghdad.
And you ask the question, why has he decided to do this? And now, obviously, he argues that it's because they were foiling a plot to kill Americans, which is, I don't think many people are finding
He'd been mediating with Saudis about, and he was bringing back the response. But anyway,
the question of why now does lend to your argument, which is that this does seem to be the kind of knee-jerk nonsense you get from Trump. But, the broader question of blame for what's happening in the Middle East at the moment does not fall at the big comb over one's feet.
I do. The history of that, and that's exactly. But even look at Pence. Pence started tweeting, sort of saying it was Iranians who were responsible for 9/11, when we know that 15 out of the 19 people responsible for 9/11 were Saudis. This was no action taken against Saudis. And if Pence is saying that, which he knows is not true, Trump is doing these things on Twitter where he's threatening...
But it was a Sunni plot and not a Shia.
But do we believe in our heart of hearts that Donald Trump and Pence understand the fundamental schism between Sunni and Shia in the Muslim world? I would make the argument they probably don't. And then we're left with this question. Trump is willing to say on social media, again, this horrible drug of Twitter that seems to absolutely animate him. He's saying, well, you know what we're going to do? This is my argument about disproportionality. He's saying, we're going to pick 52 sites in Iran because we remember the 52 hostages, an old grudge that we're bringing back to bear, and we're going to bomb them. And some of them are cultural sites. And that's a war crime. It's an obvious war crime. And he's stating it as a term of policy. And again, that doesn't feel like strategy. That doesn't feel like there's even the possibility of an end game. It's posturing. It's flexing.
Schoolyard.
And if that's what we've got ever, if we end up with Trump trades threats with Iran in chilling social media battle, and that is the world of 2020.
Let's move on. You hold your thought to the Mail as well. 1 million gather to mourn the dead warlord. But we also wanted to see the headline of that, which is Boris warns Trump, don't bomb Iran's World Heritage sites. The question is, what does the UK government do with this impulsive foreign policy that we're discussing in order to keep friends with Trump, given the trade deal that they say they need, but also to clip the wings of this individual as well?
Well, I mean, something like this kind of ridiculous act, it seems, so puerile, so ridiculously kind of... what's the point of bombing cultural sites other than, as Stig says, to kind of show who's got, more machismo, who's going to have the last word, in a sense. But the interesting thing is how the UK and other countries in Europe will react, because obviously we look back to ISIS and Palmyra and the destruction there, and there was a, rightly so, widely held sense that this was a terrible act, not just against people in that region and their country, but against this idea of human history. And this is a global issue, not just because it's the cultural heritage sites, but also because if the US does end up getting involved in a war with Iran or Iraq or whoever, then the UK necessarily has to respond. And are we going to continue to be buddied up with the US even when Trump is making such ridiculous claims as he is at the moment? It seems like, not to get all kind of what's that scene from Love Actually, but like the UK does have to stand up at some point. Boris is walking along a tightrope that he can't come down on either side at the moment.
So, two more front pages then on this. The Guardian, once again picturing the extraordinary funeral scenes. US forced to deny plan to quit Iraq. We've already talked about that. And then the Times as well. The story from Deborah Haynes, MOD sends emergency evacuation team to Iraq, getting people out of Iraq and...
Because they're concerned and the other question, of course, that looms in all of this, because there is no straightforward side in the Middle East. That's the other great, often your enemy's enemy isn't your friend. The problem we have in all of this, as there's greater instability, the rise of ISIS becomes a feature again. And so the area becomes more unstable, and so the MOD then have a responsibility to British ships that are there, to British people that are there, to protect them.
OK. We will move on to other matters after the break, including the Golden Globes host who dropped more than a few jaws. Back with that in just a moment.